Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring the 1970s, remembering the 1970s, and I'm pleased once again to be with my dear old friend Saul-Paul Sirag, with whom I shared many adventures back in that decade and in subsequent decades as well. Saul-Paul is the author of ADEX Theory, how the ADE Coxeter graphs unify mathematics and physics. He was also mentioned extensively in the fascinating book by David Kaiser, a historian of science at MIT, called How the Hippies Saved Physics. In addition, he has written a chapter, an appendix actually, in my book, The Roots of Consciousness, in the second edition, published in 1993. And that appendix is called Consciousness, a Hyperspace View. And now I'll switch over to the YouTube channel and we'll continue with my friend Saul-Paul Sirag. Well, welcome, Saul-Paul. Once again, pleasure to be with you. Let's begin with the day we met, which, as I recall, was on my birthday in 1971, at a time when I was living at a house in Berkeley the university had funded, and I was the director of a program there called the Health Information Program.
Yeah, that's right. And how I got to your birthday party, you didn't know me and I didn't know you, so why was I attending your birthday party?
Well, as I recall, there was a fellow named Art Rosenbloom who came with you, who yes. I didn't know him either.
Yeah, Art Rosenbloom lived in Philadelphia, and starting in September of 1971, I was writing a series of newspaper articles that I called The New Alchemy on various topics of basically new things in science that I thought related to the old claims of alchemy. That's why I called it The New Alchemy. And these were for a company called a brand new company in Berkeley called Alternative Features Services that was started by a couple of friends of mine. And I was paid $15 a week for these columns. And they were distributed all over the country in college newspapers and underground hippie-type newspapers. And he had been reading in Philadelphia, my articles, and he had come to Berkeley to interview various people, including me. He called me up. He got my number from the Alternative Feature Services headquarters. Their small, very very tiny office, and he called me up and wanted to meet me. And so I said, well, where should I meet you? And he said, well, I'm going to be going to a birthday party to meet a woman that he was interested in who lived in Berkeley. And she was going to be at the party and he was going to meet up with her. And that's how I got to your birthday party in that very roundabout way.
It's funny. Yeah, because I remember he had written a book, as I recall, or maybe it was like a comic book called Weird Science.
Yes, that's correct. I think I have that somewhere. And all the things I have a huge collection of the stuff from the 60s and 70s and later, among all my books and papers and so on. I mean, it's a treasure trove of stuff from that period, of course.
Well, my recollection is that that evening you and I had a conversation about LSD because you had some ideas as to how LSD impacted the brain, and I was fascinated.
Yes, in particular, I had written one of my columns. Might have been one of the most recent columns I had written about that, and in particular, I was fascinated by the fact that I had read in the scientific journals that that the pineal gland actually made the psychedelic molecules, and people were speculating. I think more recently than that, actually, it's been found that the pineal gland makes DMT. But at that time, they were talking about such things as harmaline, and these things are very related to serotonin. And one of the ideas in the psychedelic literature at that time was that probably the serotonin receptors in the brain. Serotonin is a very important neurotransmitter, and that LSD is so close to being serotonin that it probably is being taken up by these serotonin receptors in the brain. And I think that has turned out over the years to be a viable idea about LSD. But anyway, that's something I discussed with you at the party.
Yeah.
And you were somewhat skeptical about the pineal gland thing, because you mentioned the pineal gland, and I said, "Oh, I know a lot about the pineal gland. I can tell you some interesting things." So then I gave you some references to look up,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and you did, and decided that, oh well, that guy knew something interesting. And then we didn't meet up again until a few months later, when there was a UFO lecture on the Berkeley campus by
Stanton Friedman.
Stanton Friedman, yes, who was a very prominent UFO investigator, still is, I guess. And he gave a talk about why UFOs were for real, all the evidence that he knew at that time, and there was a lot. And there was kind of an after lecture meeting of those who wanted to ask more questions. And you and I were in this after lecture meeting, and we saw each other across the room, and then we talked to each other. And I remember we went over to your apartment on Grove Street at that time. Grove Street is now MLK Boulevard, I guess, Martin Luther King Boulevard, but it was Grove Street at that time. And we talked some more in your apartment.
Well, as I recall, it was shortly after that I was enrolled in school at the time. You were not. I was a graduate student in criminology. But a number of graduate students who I knew were interested in consciousness. Ken Pelletier, Angela Longo. And so a group of graduate students began meeting to discuss the problem of consciousness. And at one of those occasions, Ken Pelletier announced that he had a relationship with this cosmologist from the East Coast, Arthur M. Young, who would be coming out to Berkeley and offering a special seminar just for these students, and I invited you to attend.
Yes, Jeffrey, I remember that you told me about it, and you thought it might be interesting material for my column, actually. And I did write about it in my column, and I attended these lectures. It was like a weekend thing, I believe. It was like Saturday and Sunday, back to back. And this was in the spring of 1972, so it was not too long after we met up again for the second time. And one of the things I remember very, very strongly is that, well, you and I both asked a lot of interesting questions. And so Arthur took an interest in us. And Arthur and Ruth, his wife, invited me to lunch with them on someplace on Shattuck Avenue, which was not too far from the psychology building, which was Tolman Hall, which is where where Ken Pelletier was a graduate student and where the seminar was being held. And I remember distinctly, I have a very, very distinct memory of crossing, I guess it's Oxford Street, along the west side of the campus, and Arthur Young telling me at that point about Uri Geller. This is the time I heard about Uri Geller, actually, and the fact that he was being studied at Stanford Research Institute. And that really fascinated me. And then they were talking about, he and Ken Pelletier especially were talking about setting up an institute in Berkeley. This was in the spring of 73. And that institute basically was founded that summer. And you, Jeffrey, and I were the first two invited to actually live at the institute. And Arthur and Ruth had an apartment in the Institute building on Benvenue Avenue, which they bought. A very nice building for their purposes. It had a huge front room that was where all the teaching happened for the large groups. And then there was a smaller room called the library room, which was for smaller classes. And we lived upstairs, actually. Basically a converted attic.
Right.
They were tiny rooms, but they were sufficient for us.
So we moved into the Institute for the Study of Consciousness in the summer of 1973.
Yeah, in August, as I remember. Yeah.
I think I moved in sooner and you moved in a little later because you were married and you broke up with your wife in order to move into the Institute.
Well, actually, the situation with my wife was very complex. I was living on Adeline Street in a big apartment on Adeline Street with my wife, who I was still married to, and her boyfriend, Seth, who she later married, and also with Nancy Royston, who was an artist friend of mine that I'd met in New York when I was working in theater in New York in the 60s, 66 to 69, and Nancy kind of followed me out to California, and she was in New York. I introduced her to Leslie. She was a good friend of Leslie's, and so it was a foursome, actually.
Leslie was your wife.
Leslie was my wife. Yeah. Nancy was my girlfriend, and Seth was my wife's boyfriend. And four of us. This is Berkeley in around 1970, 71.
Well, you left them all.
I left them all, yeah. But I kept in touch with them. So.
Yeah. I'm aware of that, of course.
Nancy is also the one, you probably know this too, that introduced me to Mary Min, who I married in 1991, and we're still living together in Eugene. So she was an important link. Nancy, this artist, was an important link between Mary Min and me, too. It's complicated, let's say.
What I particularly remember about Nancy is that long before microdosing of LSD became popular, she used to do it. She was taking a little bit of LSD every single day, as I recall.
Yes, and she painted. That's how she did a lot of her paintings. I have much of her artwork in my house, and in particular, the painting that she painted in that apartment at the time, that this foursome was going on, and her room was right next to my room. Her room was basically a studio-sized room, and I had a tiny closet-sized room. But I would go and visit her while she was painting, and it's an incredibly beautiful painting that I have, hanging on the wall of our house right now. And we have a lot of paintings in our house because Mary Min is a painter, and Mary Min's mother was a painter. So, we have lots of paintings.
Yeah.
We have some of Leslie's artwork, too. Leslie was an artist also, among other things.
Okay. So I guess, an interesting episode really that's worth going into some detail on is our relationship with Arthur Young.
Yes.
At the Institute. I know he had a big impact on you in the development of your own theories, but he had a theory of his own as well.
Yes, and his theory he published in two books, basically, called The Reflexive Universe and The Geometry of Meaning, and very detailed idea about how everything fits together in some grand design, including the biological realm and the chemical realm and the particle realm, and actually the highest realm in his view was the light, actually, and everything according to his cosmology, everything comes from a very, very high energy photon at the beginning of the universe. And interestingly enough, the second level, which is supposed to deal with particle physics, in other words, between light and chemical molecules, it's, of course, the molecules are made up of electrons and protons and things. So that in the book and elsewhere has simply says work in progress.
Yeah.
The reason it says work in progress is because Arthur and I couldn't agree on what to put there. I had proposed some elaborate quark idea for that seemed to fit his scheme, his 7-level scheme. But he didn't like the idea of the existence of quarks. Even he was very skeptical about the existence of quarks at that time. Maybe never got his head around the existence of quarks. Even though at this time in 1973 was when the quark model was sort of really being accepted by the physics community, but it was still controversial, one would say, in 73. But that's another story, how particle physics advances.
He didn't like hyperspace, and he didn't like the idea, as I recall, of a multiplicity of new subatomic particles being found.
Yeah, and the problem was that the Berkeley accelerator, the Bevatron, was discovering new subatomic particles almost weekly at that time in the early 70s, and there were other big particle accelerators all over the world. In Russia and on the East Coast, and at Stanford there was the linear accelerator, and in 1974, a new subatomic particle was discovered called it was a type of quark. It was called charm. Okay, and that was the big deal in 1974, the charm quark, which had been predicted previously, so it was discovered in 1974 at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and that was a big boost to the quark theory, actually, of subatomic particles. Like the proton is supposed to be made up of 3 quarks, 2 up quarks and a down quark, and the neutron is supposed to be made up of the opposite. In other words, 2 down quarks and 1 up quark. But then there are other levels of other types of quarks, the strange quark and the charm quark, which are like the up and down in many ways. So it's called the second generation, or the second family of quarks, and then there's a third family that was discovered later. So the idea that I'm getting across here is that the quark theory was very much a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
So Arthur, was in a way right to be cautious about it, but he just rejected it, and rejected a lot of these new ideas like the charmed quark out of hand. And I thought that was not a great idea.
And of course, we can look back now from the perspective of decades and know that it's quite well accepted at this point.
Oh, absolutely. It's called the Standard Model of particle physics. Is the 3 families of quarks and other particles. And yeah, so it's so accepted. It's called the Standard Model in physics.
But he had developed his cosmology earlier, and to a large degree it was based on earlier science, and I think he had a hard time making that adjustment because it meant maybe his models wouldn't work so well.
Yeah, quite likely, yeah. But later on, back in the, I was at the Institute until the fall of 1977. And then later on in the 80s, when I was living in San Francisco, involved with Henry Dakin's Washington Research Institute, I had become very interested in a certain algebraic structure called E7, and I thought, Arthur should be interested in E7 because there's that magic 7, and so I visited Arthur, and one of the first things that Arthur said to me is, I've become interested in E7. And I said, Arthur, I can tell you a whole lot about E7 because I've been studying it. And then Arthur didn't want to hear what I had to say about it. I think he was afraid that I would scoop him or something. I don't know. But it was strange because I could have really told him a lot about E7, and actually, it's an example of a Lie algebra, okay? And I recall that the first time I ever heard the word Lie algebra was when a mathematician, a graduate student at Berkeley, was visiting Arthur, and they were discussing basically Arthur's idea of the real numbers, and Arthur didn't believe that real numbers really existed in some Platonic sense, that only fractions existed, and they were arguing about this, and I asked him, well, what are you working on? As a graduate student. He says, well, I'm working on Lie algebras. That's the first time I heard the word. And I said, well, what's that? And all he said was, well, that's something that starts out being one thing and it ends up being something else. But that didn't tell me much about Lie algebras. So, of course, I went to Moe's bookstore in Berkeley and started reading up on Lie algebras, which turned out to be very important in my own work. As I pointed out, E7 is a particular Lie algebra, and Lie group, too. I'd heard about Lie groups before, but not Lie algebras, strangely, although they're incredibly closely related.
And when the student said you start with one thing and it turns into something else, the Lie algebra, therefore, I'm assuming, is about how you transform one object into a different appearing object while maintaining certain features of its identity.
Perhaps that's what he meant. It was kind of a mysterious statement. I should have pushed him more, but I didn't want to interrupt, his discussion with Arthur too much. But I just put a bee in my bonnet about I've got to check up on this stuff,
Yeah.
And that's the way I was learning. I was, Arthur would challenge me with mathematical type puzzles to work on, and in 1974, early 1974, he asked me to work out the symmetry structure of a tetrahedron. So, and that's how I got into working on the octahedral group, which is full symmetry of the tetrahedron. If you rotate the tetrahedron only, then you get a subgroup called the tetrahedral group, of course. But if you also allow reflections of the tetrahedron, then you get the full octahedral group. And the octahedral group is simply the group of all the permutations of four things. And the four vertices of the tetrahedron permuted will give you the octahedral group. And I worked that out literally by manipulating a tetrahedron that Arthur gave me to work. I still have that tetrahedron that Arthur gave me to work out from the object itself. Arthur was a very hands-on kind of guy. He was an inventor, after all. He had invented a very fundamental aspect of the Bell helicopter, the rotor system, and it's one of his main claims to fame before he got interested in he'd always been interested in metaphysics and the paranormal and so on. And as soon as the Bell helicopter started being manufactured in 1947 and 48, he left Bell to work on what he was more interested in, which he called the Psi-copter.
Yeah. But in effect, it was metaphysics.
It was metaphysics, and it was more than metaphysics. It was also a great interest in the experiments, like the ones being done with Uri Geller and other people, investigating paranormal phenomena in general. He was very interested in that.
And he financed some of that early work. He financed some of that early work.
He financed a lot of that work. And he also traveled around and visited people all over the country, maybe in other places like Australia, maybe, but mainly the U.S. And he called it his gee whiz period. When he would anything strange that people were claiming, he would go and investigate. He would talk to the people who were doing it and decide for himself whether it had legs, whether there was anything to it, or whether, so he met an awful lot of people who were doing interesting things, and this influenced his view of reality and his cosmology.
So he
called Reflexive universe.
He was a cosmologist. He had invented the Bell helicopter. He was knowledgeable in many, many different areas of science, but he also became an astrologer and a proponent of radionics and a few other strange things. A deep, deep student of ufology.
Yes, he would talk about the saucers from time to time with me, and he really thought they were for real, and I agree with him that there's something real going on there. Not every report is for real, but there's enough reality there that we need to pay attention to it, certainly. And Arthur certainly influenced me, although I had first heard about flying saucers going all the way back to when I was in the fourth grade near Philadelphia, because my fourth grade teacher, every time she read about flying saucers in the newspaper, would read the story to the class, this fourth grade class. And I met up with her years later in the 60s, And one of the first things she talked to me about was flying saucers. She was still into it. She lived to be 100 years old, by the way.
Fascinating.
When Arthur was talking about UFOs, then, of course, my mind went all the way back to the fourth grade, where I first started hearing about flying saucers. And this was I was in the fourth grade from 1948 to 49. And at that time, newspapers were publishing everything like that. They started not publishing these stories later on, but in the 40s, in the late 40s and early 50s, there were a lot of stories about UFOs in the newspapers.
Well,
And
it's ironic because when I was in the fourth grade, much later than that, this would have, since I'm younger than you, it would have been in the mid-50s. But it was the fourth grade. I began reading UFO books myself from the public library, and I even wrote a letter to Donald Menzel, who was a professor of astronomy at Harvard University, who had written.
He was a debunker. He was a UFO debunker, and one of the most important debunkers because of his position as an astronomer at Harvard University, after all.
So I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back to me when I was in the fourth grade.
You were in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Did he debunk your the things?
Yeah. He did indeed. He wanted to make sure I understood that UFOs did not exist.
Interesting. Yeah. So we both had this fourth grade experience, which I didn't know about before, and you didn't know about.
No,
Mike.
but it really is. Our friendship was sort of solidified when we met at the UFO presentation of Stanton Friedman.
That's right. And then when we were with Arthur, it was we heard a lot more about UFOs from Arthur and his friends, other people. And Jacques Vallée came to the Institute and gave a talk about UFOs, for instance.
That's right. Yep. While we were living there, and I interviewed him for KPFA radio at the time. And also, it's probably worth mentioning that. Of course. You developed a relationship with Jack Sarfati back in those years.
Yeah, Jack Sarfati actually showed up at the Institute on his birthday, the 14th of September, which was 2 weeks after my birthday. We're almost the same age. We were both born in 1939. And he had been invited to look me up at the Institute by Arthur back in Philadelphia. Arthur was not at the Institute in the summer. He and Ruth were in residence at the Institute for 2 months in the fall and then 2 months in the spring when there were events that were at the Institute, scheduled events, like speakers, like we just mentioned Jacques Vallée speaking, but there were many other very interesting speakers at the Institute for the Study of Consciousness. Anyway, so Jacques Sarfati told me almost right away about his strange experience of the telephone call when he was like maybe 12 or 13 years old in New York, in Brooklyn, where he grew up, and the telephone call to him sounded like some kind of machine speaking, and it said, if you go to the fire escape and look out, we can pick you up. He did not go to the fire escape. What he did was he ran down to the street and told his buddies about it. and nothing happened. But here's the interesting thing about that story is that in 1974, Andrija Puharich's book about Uri Geller, the book called Uri, came out, and of course there are a lot of stories in there about extraterrestrial contact with Puharich and Geller, mainly in Israel, I believe. But anyway, there was also stories about strange mechanical voices, which were on tapes that claimed that these ETs that were in contact were from something called spectra, and so on. And Jack was given that book by Puharich when he in New York in '74, and Jack's mother was still living in New York, and he took it over. He was visiting his mother, and he gave her the book to read. And he didn't even read it himself. He just handed it over to his mother, and his mother started reading it and came across the part of the book that talks about the strange messages, and she said, "Jack, this happened to you. This happened to you way back when." And there was a whole week of these calls, and Jack had remembered only one, interestingly enough. And she said that the calls kept coming, and eventually she grabbed the phone out of Jack's hand and said, "You stop bothering my boy," like a Jewish mother would, I suppose. Yeah. So Jack to this day doesn't remember those other phone calls, just that one. Which is strange, of course, but his mother remembers them.
Well, and it was about that time when I also sponsored a symposium in the Berkeley campus, and Andrija Puharich came and talked about his relationship with Uri Geller, and a few months later I brought Uri Geller to his first major live public appearance in the United States, which was on the Berkeley campus, and you then had a subsequent adventure with Geller.
Yeah, it's a result of my contact with Geller that was largely due to Jeffrey's sponsorship of a conference of several people. Puharich was just one of the speakers, but he spent his whole talk talking about Geller, and so I wanted to do more, research on Geller and go to New York and everything. And luckily, there was an editor at Esquire magazine who had been reading my columns, my
New Alchemy
columns. Yeah. And he called me up and said that he wanted me to write a big article for Esquire magazine about all the latest research on the brain, neuroscience. And I said, well, I'd love to do that, but first I want to go to New York and meet with Geller and Puharich and investigate that story for you. And he authorized me to do that and wrote me a letter authorizing me to do that. And so when Puharich came out the second time with Geller to do when Geller did many interesting things on the Berkeley campus. We can go into that if you want, but anyway, so I got to go to New York in the spring of 1973, and meet with Puharich and Geller, and had a lot of interesting things happen. And I wrote up the article for Esquire. It was a very long article, and Esquire turned it down because they said that actually my editor loved it, and he basically accepted it. But the editor, he was a lower level editor, and the editor above him rejected it because he said it would be too hard for them to verify the things I was claiming. Of course, that's true. It'd be very difficult for Esquire to verify it, but that was just an excuse. It was too controversial for them, basically.
Well, you observed some extraordinary things, and I think we should go into that.
Yeah, a lot of interesting things because I was there for several weeks, and the first thing he did when I met him was to he was famous for being able to bend metal, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so I held out one of my keys, and he said, I had it in the palm of my hand, and he didn't touch it. He just waved his hand over it, and immediately it started bending. And not only did it start bending, but even when he stopped waving his hand, it kept bending. Okay, and many other people have reported this kind of metal behavior, that once it starts bending, it doesn't necessarily stop. Mm-hmm. And actually it kept bending, and then it even broke. Mm-hmm. Okay,
a key.
A key, yeah.
Which, if you had needed that key, that would have been a problem.
That would have been a problem. Well, I had acquired. I knew that he bent keys, so I had brought a bunch of keys with me for the purpose, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't the key that I absolutely needed, of course.
But he did the same thing to Ed May, our colleague Ed May, probably a year or two later, and Ed gave him the key to his car, and when the key bent, Ed had to hire a locksmith to get into his own car.
Yeah. No, he didn't come as well prepared for the eventuality of losing an important key.
Yeah.
But he did a lot of other things. Like one of the things I wrote about was, I was fascinated with the fact that in the Puharich book hadn't come out yet. Mm-hmm. Mind you, that came out in '74. So a lot of the stuff in the book I hadn't even heard about, importantly. But one thing I did hear about was their Puharich and Uri's speculation that they were being influenced by things going on in the future. There was a future influence on the past going on. Mm-hmm. And that's an idea that I was fascinated with from a physicist's point of view. And so I wanted to see if Geller could make something go backwards in time. So I gave him I gave him a
bean sprout.
A bean sprout. And said, can you make this go back in time? And he kind of waved his hand over it. He was willing to take on anything, it seemed like. He waved his hands over it. And the bean sprout, he opened his hand, and there was what you would expect before the bean sprout. In other words, the bean itself, unsprouted. The mung bean, I guess it's called.
So that was quite an unusual experiment. You surprised him. He had no idea that you were going to hand him a bean sprout.
Right, and ask him to make time go backwards.
Although he had been known for taking a bean sprout and holding it in the palm of his hand while people watched, and the sprout would unfold from the seed.
Oh, he had done that, yeah, but not the backward thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So
yeah.
it had occurred to me that what if, because he was known for causing beans to sprout, that when you handed him the sprout, he happened to have a mung bean in his pocket and substituted it. It occurred to me that could have explained what you saw.
Yeah, it's possible. It's in the realm of possibility, because he was he also had been caught by various people doing tricks, one might say. Yeah, so he was a mixed bag in that sense. But the first time that I saw him on sort of his home territory, which was Puharich's house in Ossining, New York. I went out there several times to visit him. The first time I went out there, I brought the guy in New York that I was staying with, so that we'd have, two sets of eyes on everything. And by the way, that's where I did the bean sprout thing. Was in Puharich's house, and but the very first thing that happened was we got there not too long before dinner time, and it was a big table, and there were several guests and so on, and we were just standing at the table in front of our seats, and as soon as we were standing there, some of the forks started bending. We were just standing there, and we could see them bending, especially my fork in front of me. And Geller was in the kitchen at the time, helping to I guess bring out food and stuff, for this big dinner. And so that was pretty interesting. And, and my friend and I, that I brought from New York, both saw this happening, so that was quite evidential to us. And then, Puharich showed us other things like the pictures of UFOs that Geller had taken flying somewhere in Europe, just taking pictures. It was a Polaroid pictures, that he claimed he just took out the window of the plane they were in, and there were UFOs very distinct UFOs in the pictures that shown to me.
And did he know that they were going to appear on the camera, or
no? Well, Geller's story about it is simply that he had this Polaroid camera with him, and he claimed that the Polaroid camera levitated, and he decided to shoot out the window and see what was there, and you know how a Polaroid camera works. Yeah. You have one shot at a time, basically, right?
Yep.
Each picture takes a few seconds to develop, and it automatically develops before your eyes, basically.
Yep.
And there were UFOs in these Polaroid shots.
Now, as I recall, you also developed a number of ideas regarding synchronicities and this UFO connection. For example, Geller referred to it, if I remember correctly, as Huva.
Yeah, the synchronicity has not so much to do with Huva, which reminds me, of course, of Jehovah, but in the Old Testament, Yahweh. But actually, the synchronicities had to do more with spectra, and that happened in 1973, and I was back in Berkeley, of course, by the summer of 1973. I started hearing stories from actually stories from Ray Stanford, who I hadn't met yet, but
a psychic, Ray Stanford.
Ray Stanford, a psychic, very interested in UFOs too, by the way.
Yes.
And Alan Vaughan at that time was the articles editor for Psychic Magazine, and he had done a lot of interviews, including interviewing all the people who Jeffrey had brought to Berkeley for this big conference that he did in '73.
Alan Vaughan became a good friend of ours.
Yes. Well, he also taught at the Institute, for that matter. He taught psychic development exercises at the Institute.
A course that we both took, as I recall.
That's correct. Yeah, and that's how we really got to know Alan Vaughan. And so by the so Alan Vaughan and I would call each other up to talk about the latest synchronicity kind of thing, and whatever interested us that had to do with psychic stuff. And so Alan Vaughan had interviewed Ray Stanford, and I started hearing stories about that he had brought back, that Alan Vaughan had brought back from Texas. He was in Ray Stanford was in Austin, Texas at that time, and Ray Stanford had very strange stories. He claimed that his car had been teleported while he was in the process of driving to the airport to pick Geller up to give a demonstration and talk, maybe on the campus. I don't know, somewhere in Austin, and he claimed that this actually happened twice on two separate occasions, and the car had suffered quite a bit of electrical damage to the electrical system, and moreover, Ray Stanford attributed this to agencies that he called spectra, and that he associated with hawk-like entities.
Yes.
Ray Stanford, and apparently these hawk-like entities had been showing up in kind of nightmare situations in his dreams. So it wasn't necessarily a pleasant experience for him. But this is all happening in the fall of 1973, okay? Well, in December of 1973, in mid-December, the January 1974 issue of Analog Magazine comes out. Now, I was an avid reader of Analog Magazine, which is a science fiction magazine at the time, and the cover of just shocked me, because the cover of this January 1974 issue of Analog Magazine had a story called "The Horus Errand." Now, the Horus Hawk thing plays a role, as it turns out, in the Uri book, but the Uri book hadn't even shown up yet. Remember, it was published in 1974, and anyway, the really shocking thing was that the figure taking up most of this cover was a guy in a Horus Hawk type helmet, and he has the Eye of Horus on his lapel, on his uniform, his white and gold uniform, and then he has a name tag, and the name tag is Stanford. Okay.
Yep.
So I immediately called Alan Vaughan, since of course he had been in contact with Ray Stanford, and I said, "Hey, you should go out and check out the latest issue of Analog, because the character is called Stanford, and it's called the Horus Errand."
Yeah.
So he, of course, immediately went out and got it, and he called me back immediately, and he said, "Hey, the guy even looks like Stanford." In a painting.
Parenthetically, I think it would be useful to mention that Alan Vaughan himself had achieved quite a bit of fame at that point in time, because he, in 1968, was known he was in Germany at the time, and he had seen an article similar to what you're talking about in a newspaper, and he put the columns together, and it read across columns that there was going to be an assassination of Robert Kennedy, and he took that as a synchronistic warning, and days before Kennedy was assassinated, he was trying to warn Kennedy about it, based on
Robert Kennedy you're talking about.
Yeah, Robert Kennedy, based on just such a synchronicity.
Yes, and nobody did anything with it, and so he actually started some organization to record such synchronicities, such synchronistic warnings. Mm-hmm. So this was kind of like a super synchronicity going on, involving. As it turns out, Geller and Ray Stanford and so on. But there were more shoes to drop on that whole story because when I was still in New York in 1973, I wanted to see if I could make contact with the ETs that presumably Geller was in contact with. So I invited Geller to come to the loft apartment of my artist friend who I was staying with in Greenwich Village, and to entice him to come, I said that I would be on LSD, and he could see me on LSD, and I would try to contact the ETs in that state, and my friend would remain straight, of course, and we could compare notes later and so on. Mm-hmm. And Puharich himself was very fascinated with psychedelics, of course, and he had famously written a book called The Magic Mushroom, The Sacred Mushroom.
Sacred Mushroom. A very interesting and important book.
Actually. The Sacred Mushroom. And that had to do with Amanita muscaria, I believe, and other things, psychedelics. And anyway, so Puharich encouraged him to follow through on this, and so he showed up with his friend Shippy. This loft, you could only get to it by riding up on a very slow freight elevator. And as soon as Geller and Shippy showed up at the door of this loft, my friend Richard Moore, who was an artist and a designer, he had designed all of his own flatware, all of his own silverware, and he had very, very heavy forks, for instance, and he held a fork in one hand. Well, Geller hadn't even entered the room; he's in the doorway. Okay, and Richard says, "You think you can bend this?" And Geller says, "Where do you want it to bend?" And he points to a place on the fork tine, and immediately it starts bending. And then Richard says, "Well, can you make it bend somewhere else?" So he points to another place, and it bends there too. All the time, Richard is holding it in one hand. Geller's not touching it. And anyway, I'm starting to go up on LSD, but I'm not in full throes of it. But Richard is quite straight during this whole period. And anyway, so then we invite them in, and Richard has ordered a huge Chinese dinner thing. So we have dinner together, this Chinese dinner together, and after a while, I decide that it might be a good time to ask Geller if this would be a good time for me to see to see the entities. And Geller says, "Well, look into my eyes." And I think, oh, well, that's not a great idea, because all I'll see is what I've heard about. Like they show up in the form of red lights, okay? And I'll see red lights in his eyes, and that won't mean anything. Well, that didn't happen. What happened when I looked into his eyes was that his whole head became like a bird of prey. And I thought it looked like an eagle, and with feathers going all the way down to his shoulders. Like he really did look like he was wearing an eagle costume, so to speak. And I jumped back and I said, Uri, you look just like an eagle. And he got very excited. He and Shippy both got very excited, but they wouldn't, tell me anything about it. Mm. So this is in the spring of '73, remember? Mm-hmm. And so when this January issue of Analog Magazine comes out with the Horus errand, then I think, there's probably a connection between my eagle experience and the Horus Hawk idea, but I still didn't know that Puharich and Geller thought that the ETs actually come in the form of peregrine falcons, which is the Horus image, of course. Yes. And I found that out only in the summer of 1974 when Puharich's book Uri came out, and then everything sort of, slid into place for me, and so this was a multiple set of synchronicities going on, and. Mm-hmm. Moreover, another interesting synchronistic aspect of the whole story is that Alan Vaughan got very interested in, that picture, and the fact that it looked like Ray Stanford and had the name Stanford and so on. So he actually wrote to the guy who painted that cover, a very famous cover painter for Analog Magazine and other magazines, a guy named Kelly Freas.
Right.
EAS, okay? Very good painter. And so Alan Vaughan wrote to him, giving him some details about why he was interested in how he painted that painting. And Kelly Freas wrote back and said, it's interesting that I never met Ray Stanford, but I did have a psychic reading done by Ray Stanford 10 years earlier. And Ray Stanford had told him in this psychic reading that in a past lifetime he had lived in ancient Egypt and had been some kind of illustrator. So Kelly Freas says in this letter to Alan Vaughan, he says, well, every time I do a cover that has any inkling of Egyptian stuff, I just exaggerate it, and he did in this case. This was set in some futuristic L.A., and there's a very huge pyramidal building, and by the way, there's also a red laser beam shooting off the top of this. Now, this isn't in the story at all, and the helmet is simply described in the story as being gold and white. Well, he turns it into a full hawk, falcon image, and so on. And also, it's interesting that Kelly Freas, where does he live? He lives in Virginia Beach. Guess why? Because he's interested in the
Edgar
Cayce materials. All of this is very interesting. Yeah. This famous science fiction cover painter lives in, Edgar Cayce land, so to speak.
Well, it also suggests that the archetype associated with the Egyptian god Horus, who is in effect the reborn deity of Osiris. Osiris, his father, is chopped up into pieces, and Isis, the wife of Osiris, gathers the pieces and puts them together and makes love, and then Horus, the hawk god, is born. Sort of like yes, Jesus returning from the resurrection.
Right. A lot of this ancient mythology, by the way, was very fascinating to Arthur Young, and he was one of the things that he talked about a lot, actually, about this particular aspect of Egyptian lore. Mm-hmm. he was very fascinated with Egyptian lore and other European mythologies as well, but especially Egyptian, I would say. And another interesting thing that Kelly Freas said in that letter is that he had never met Ray Stanford, didn't really know what he looked like, but he had painted that particular painting from imagination, and which is unusual for him, he said, because he usually paints if there's a figure, which there usually is in these covers, he paints from a photograph of some kind. Mm-hmm. But in this case, he didn't paint from a photograph; he painted from imagination, which is another interesting aspect of the whole story, the synchronistic aspect. So he painted someone who actually looked like Ray Stanford, which shocked Alan Vaughan. He called me up immediately and says, "Hey, that guy looks like Ray Stanford." Not only the name, but the face. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the job of this guy in this Horus errand is to guide the soul of a dying person into the baby of a baby that's just being born at that time. That's in some futuristic L.A. in his story. The story is all about. So
reincarnation.
Kind of, yeah. It's a reincarnation story, but it's a futuristic reincarnation in which it's scientifically aided reincarnation. Let's say.
Yeah. And I recall yet another synchronicity at the time involving the hawk. And if I remember rightly, it was that in an issue of, I believe it was Science magazine or Nature, that published some of the very first reports of research with Uri Geller, I think at SRI International, on the cover of that issue. They went back 100 years to show the cover 100 years ago, and it was a picture of a hawk that had been wired. You have that cover.
I have the whole issue, I think. That was an article in Nature written by Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff on the work with Uri Geller at SRI, and it's the only time anything like that has been published in Nature, as far as I know. It was very controversial, to say the least. In the offices of Nature itself, in fact, the editor wrote an editorial in which he was taking some issue with it, although he was willing, he had to sign off on getting it published, but he wanted to record his own misgivings about this kind of research, which is a standard, of course, in the scientific community, especially the very established scientific community, such as Nature magazine, probably the most established journal of that kind, weekly journal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I might mention to you, Saul-Paul, parenthetically, that the American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, just last month published a major article summarizing all the research in parapsychology and drawing very positive conclusions. So psychologists are traditionally the most hostile to parapsychology, and to me that's a major turning point. I think actually parapsychology has turned the corner, at least with regard to the psychologists.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about that.
I'll send you a copy.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. So this stuff was very exciting, to say the least, in the 70s. Yeah. We had the idea that the 70s was going to be the breakthrough decade of parapsychology and other far out things like UFOs and all the stuff that Arthur Young was interested in, basically.
But it also brought to the fore the whole notion of the Jungian synchronicity and how important it was for understanding all of this.
Yes, the term synchronicity was coined, I think, by Carl Jung, actually in a book that has two parts, the synchronicity part, and then there's a second part by a famous physicist named
Pauli.
Wolfgang Pauli, about Kepler and his interest in mythology and so on. Kepler is kind of a transitional figure between between the medieval point of view and the modern point of view, but also it should be known that Pauli and Jung were very close in many ways, because for one thing, Pauli at that time was, of course, this is not mentioned in this book, in that book, but it's very significant that Pauli was actually a patient of, and it was revealed many years later that the most interesting dreams that Jung recorded were Pauli's dreams, which were related to physics, by the way, a lot of them. And they became very close friends. They both lived in Zurich, not too far from each other. There's a very interesting book about that that's come out recently called The Search for the Cosmic Number.
Oh.
And they were both fascinated with the fine structure constant number 137, which Eddington and Arthur Young were very interested in too, for that matter. But they had no idea. Arthur Young had no idea that Pauli Arthur Young knew about this book, of course, and was very interested in, for that matter, in Jungian psychology. In fact, Arthur Young had gone through Jungian analysis, which was one of the big influences on his being interested in the paranormal, as a matter of fact. And that's a very interesting story, is why Arthur Young got interested in Jungian analysis. And what he told us, you probably remember this story too. What he told us is that when he was still working at the Bell Helicopter Company, that he lost the use of his arms. His arms just got so weak he could hardly lift them, and so he decided that he was going to go the medical route first, and if they couldn't find out what was wrong and fix it, then he was going to go the psychology route and do Jungian analysis. Well, the medical professionals couldn't find out anything wrong with his neurology that would create something like that. And by the way, he said that the reason he thought it was happening was because there were of course crashes of the helicopters going on. Yeah. And he was very, very disturbed by this at Bell. And of course,
I think they lost a test pilot.
They lost at least one test pilot, and others were probably injured. So he thinks that had an effect. But anyway, so he went through Jungian analysis, and he said it was largely dream analysis. So Arthur Young got really interested in dream analysis, and he said almost immediately when he got into Jungian analysis, his arms came back to life, so to speak. But he said it was so interesting that he continued doing it anyway for years. He was in Jungian analysis.
Until later he eventually concluded that astrology was even more powerful than Jungian analysis.
Well, of course, Jung himself was very interested in astrology and writes about it in that Synchronicity book, for one thing. I can tell you another interesting thing about that book, by the way, that and Alan Vaughan and so on. It's and the Nick Herbert is a physicist who was very active. He came to visit me at the Institute. I first met him when he came to the Institute for a little mini conference in 1973, and we got to be good friends. He was very active also in the physics, fundamental physics group on the Berkeley campus. That's written about in How the Hippies Saved Physics. He's one of the most important people in that group. And anyway, so he had developed this this thing that he calls the metaphase typewriter. Which
I remember that.
You were involved in his very first experiment at the UC Medical Center in San Francisco. And you were there, I was there, a few other people were there. And I won't go into the details of how the experiment was done, except that after that experiment, then we wanted to do another version of the experiment in which a psychic would try to influence the output of this metaphase typewriter, which was just a computer generated gobbledygook coming, which was triggered by atomic
activity, random activity,
radioactivity. It's called of some element, and so in other words, totally random, but it would have imposed on its second order English letter statistics to see if something readable would come out.
As I recall, Nick Herbert determined that the distribution of letters from the English alphabet in words was mappable according to something known as Poisson statistics.
Yes, well, the thing is that this radioactivity obeys Poisson statistics, and English letters also obey Poisson statistics. So that's why he could make a match between the two. Yeah. We won't go into Poisson statistics, but that's very important point you're making. Anyway, so we recruited Alan Vaughan as the psychic to try to influence the output, and the idea is that we would in some quasi-random way pick target words that he would try to make appear. And anyway, the target words, didn't actually appear. But what did appear was the phrase very clearly, by Jung. Okay? And Alan Vaughan, seeing that happen, says, where did that come from? And at that moment, a technician, a woman, dressed in a lab coat and everything, walks by and says, maybe from here. And she pulls out the portable Jung from her lab coat pocket. Says, well, maybe from here. Talk about synchronicity. I mean, that's like really out of left field. That was the most interesting thing that happened in that particular experiment.
Well, in the original experiment, if I remember rightly, it also cranked out a phrase, at least phonetically, and an infinite time.
Yes. I make a big deal of that. I made a big deal of it at the time, because here's why. Because when the output was through basically a teletype machine, mm-hmm. and so it has a paper feed thing and so on. And when the letters started spewing out from, just zap, 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 one line after another.
Random letters.
The the paper wasn't advancing properly, and so Nick went over to the print, to the teletype thing, and just pulled the paper straight so it would start advancing. But by that time, the paper had been just not advancing, but just sort of skewing around, and so there were lines after lines being printed over each other. Okay, but once he pulled the paper straight, then we could see what that was. But the thing is that in the middle of these lines that were crossing each other at various angles, because, as I say, the paper was skewing around in the machine, right in the middle there was this phrase, "and in infinite time." And that to us was a synchronicity, because, you see, we had been joking a lot about what this experiment really amounted to. And we said, well, it's like the monkeys on a typewriter thing, and which is, an old kind of illustration that's used in statistics, I suppose.
If you have enough monkeys on typewriters, eventually they would type the complete works of Shakespeare if they had infinite time.
If they had infinite time. Exactly. And so we were joking about that leading up to this, and then an infinite time comes out.
Food for thought.
Let's talk about synchronicity.
Yeah. Well, so we were all in those years deeply engaged with the idea of synchronicities and paranormal phenomena and UFOs and psychokinesis.
Yes, all wrapped up in one untidy bundle.
They all seem to kind of interpenetrate each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very, very exciting, and at the same time, remember that we were. I don't know if you were going to the group up in Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. That Nick and I were going to.
I went occasionally.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Mm-hmm. So you saw that group in action.
Oh yeah.
Twice. Yeah. And that was very interesting, because we were investigating the foundations of quantum mechanics through the lens of the Bell's theorem type experiments that John Clauser was doing there. And John Clauser was a very important member of the group and attended regularly. And there were other faculty members that were very involved, like Henry Stapp, who was really the theoretical expert on Bell's theorem and had written many papers about it. And he was interested in applying Bell's theorem to the understanding of consciousness, which he still is. He's written a book about it and many papers about it.
He just turned 90, I believe.
He's still alive, yeah. There was some sort of big party for him, I think, when he turned 90. Maybe they're going to do a festschrift, or did. I don't know. He's still there. He's still at Berkeley. He still goes to his office. He's emeritus, of course.
Yeah.
He had a really enviable position, because he was a full professor at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and didn't have to teach. He had graduate students only that he would guide through their PhD process, and other than that, he could study anything he wanted. And he chose to spend most of his time on the Bell theorem related aspect of quantum theory. He was also a very strong advocate of S-matrix theory, which was a Berkeley specialty led by Jeffrey Chu, who was the head of the theory group. And Jeffrey Chu attended these meetings too, by the way. S-matrix theory was a rival to the quark theory of particle physics, but it didn't. The quark theory won out in that battle by 1973-74, But here's something that a lot of people don't realize, and that is that S-matrix theory led almost directly to string theory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that was not wasted effort. It turned out, the S-matrix theory, and people that really know the history of string theory know that string theory comes out of S-matrix theory.
Yeah.
And I won't go into that because that's pretty.
But it's yet another example of the very heady times. We're dealing with a time in which we're engaged in the frontiers of physics and philosophy, and also paranormal research.
Yeah, we assumed that all these things were intimately related, and we still do. At least I still do, and you still do. I don't know if everybody in that group. Well, I don't know. Some of them are still around. Some of them have moved on. It was a very interesting group. I met a lot of interesting people who came to the group. The thing about the group is that anybody could attend. Mm-hmm. And so you attended, and other psychologists, people in psychology attended, and people in biology, biophysics, and so on attended.
Yep.
These things we assumed were all related after all. Yep. So it was proper for them to attend.
Well, Saul-Paul, we've been going for quite a while now, so this may be a good time to wrap it up for the time being. Sure,
I'm fine with that. And I'm sure there's a lot more for you and I to talk about.
Oh, yeah. There's a great deal more, though. The 70s, to me, it was a time of enormous fertility, and I suppose I expected that, the flowers that were going to come out of that fertile soil would grow into a huge forest almost immediately, and I've been disappointed because I thought parapsychology would have become much more mainstream over the last half century, but I'm still optimistic it will.
Yeah, especially as you mentioned this recent paper that.
Yeah. So I want to thank you once again for being with me, Saul-Paul. I look forward to more conversations with you, and I would like to thank our viewers for being with us as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. It was a lot of fun going way back there.